Most women never realize how powerful their absence becomes until a man begins to question the very structure of his own emotional world. In the silent distance of a woman who has reclaimed herself, something ancient is awakened, something Jung once described as the shadow that rises when a man is finally forced to see what he has long avoided. Female detachment, when it is born not from bitterness but from inner clarity, becomes a forbidden psychology that reshapes the dynamic between the masculine and the feminine. It does not beg, it does not chase, it does not collapse under the weight of longing. It becomes a mirror so sharp that a man can no longer hide from his own reflection. A detached woman is never empty. She is full of herself in the most sacred way. She holds her energy close, no longer leaking it into the cracks of another person's inconsistency. She does not plead for validation, because the feminine that has awakened within her recognizes the illusion of approval. This is the moment a man begins to feel the shift, not in her words, but in her silence. Her silence carries a weight his ego cannot interpret, and that uncertainty begins to crack open the facade he built around his desires. In Jungian terms, the detached woman becomes the anima reclaimed. She stops performing the roles projected onto her and stands instead as an independent archetype, a feminine force no longer molded by another's needs. Men are startled by this because most are accustomed to women who give, explain, soothe, and diminish themselves in the name of connection. But when a woman pulls inward, when she lets the storm around her settle and chooses to sit in the calm center, the masculine consciousness becomes unsettled. He senses that something he once controlled has slipped from his grasp, and that is where the forbidden psychology begins. Detachment, in its truest form, is not cold. It is luminous. It is the warmth of a flame that burns steadily rather than wildly. It is the energy of a woman who has realized that her emotional labor is a gift, not a duty. When you detach, you don't shut down, you rise above. You observe without absorbing. You see without surrendering. You allow the world to come to you rather than running toward the world with empty hands. This psychological shift is why your silence hits differently. It is why a man suddenly worries about losing access to your softness, your empathy, your intuitive understanding of his inner world. The more you withdraw into the quiet sanctuary of your own self-worth, the more his unconscious reacts. Jung believed that every man carries within him a feminine counterpart, and when the real woman he is drawn to steps back, it awakens his internal feminine, the part of him he rarely faces. This creates a tension within him, a hunger, a longing, a fear. He begins to feel you differently, not as a possession but as a presence, not as a convenience but as a consequence of his actions. Your detachment forces him into shadow work, often without him realizing it. He wonders why your absence feels louder than your presence ever did. He replays conversations in his mind. He questions where the connection shifted, how the power reversed, why the dynamic no longer bends in his favor. But the truth is simple. When a woman reclaims her boundaries, the energy imbalance corrects itself. And as you pull away from emotional dependence, something sacred unfolds. You become less available to chaos and more attuned to your own inner voice. You become a witness to your own evolution. The Stoics would describe this as the moment a woman stops being swayed by external forces. Seneca wrote that true power is the ability to hold oneself steady when others waver. Marcus Aurelius believed that detachment is not a withdrawal from life, but a mastery of it. Through the feminine lens, your detachment becomes spiritual discipline, an alignment with the higher self that refuses to be diluted. You may not realize it, but this kind of detachment creates a gravitational pull, not because you intend to attract, but because you no longer depend on attraction. Men sense when a woman has stepped into her power. They feel it in the way she no longer reacts. They sense it in the way she no longer fills silences with explanations. They notice it in the way she no longer tries to fix what she didn't break. This is the kind of feminine detachment that alters dynamics. It is the kind that turns emotional chaos into clarity. It is the kind that forces the masculine to step forward with intention or step aside entirely. And the deeper this detachment grows, the more the unconscious layers of the masculine begin to unravel. There comes a moment in a man's psyche when he realizes that the woman he once took for granted is no longer operating within the emotional script he expected. Her detachment does not provoke anger, it provokes confusion. And confusion, in Jungian psychology, is the gateway to the unconscious. It is the moment his ego loses control and the deeper layers of his mind rise to the surface, uninvited. Your distance becomes the catalyst, the trigger, the silent force drawing him inward, compelling him to confront what he avoided when your attention was easy and your affection predictable. A detached woman becomes a psychological disruption. She is no longer tied to the emotional currency the world conditioned her to spend freely. She now understands the cost of overgiving, the exhaustion of pouring into a man who treats consistency like a luxury. When she steps back, the masculine senses an unfamiliar void, a void he tries to fill but cannot, because the energy he once absorbed has returned to its rightful owner. In this space, your energy transforms from accessible to sacred. You are no longer an emotional convenience. You are a spiritual threshold. And it is here that men feel the weight of their own shadows, the unresolved wounds, the insecurities they masked with bravado, the ego that demanded attention but gave so little in return. Your detachment shines a light on all of it. He begins to replay the moments where you softened, the messages you sent with sincerity, the times you held space for his storms while abandoning your own, the warmth you gave without hesitation. And suddenly, he sees the imbalance. He sees the version of himself reflected back through your withdrawal, a man who took more than he offered, a man who underestimated the value of a woman aligned with her self-worth. This realization is what stirs his obsession. Not with you as a person, but with the version of himself he fears he has become. Jung believed that the anima, the inner feminine essence within every man, awakens through relationship. But when the external woman retreats, his inner feminine is forced to emerge, often in the form of longing, guilt, regret, or a desperate pull toward what he cannot control. Your detachment becomes the echo of that inner voice he has silenced for years. And as the distance grows, something paradoxical happens. Your energy becomes more present to him in absence than it ever was in presence. This is the forbidden paradox of feminine detachment. A woman who no longer needs becomes a woman he cannot forget. A woman who walks away becomes a woman he sees everywhere. A woman who stops explaining becomes a woman whose silence speaks in the language of his deepest fears and desires. You may feel nothing dramatic as you detach. There is no anger, no storm, no emotional explosion. Instead, it is a quiet reclamation, a steady reclaiming of your power, the subtle but decisive choice to stop watering dead soil. This stillness, this inner calm, is exactly what shakes the masculine unconscious, because he cannot argue with silence. He cannot manipulate clarity. He cannot diminish a woman who no longer internalizes his inconsistency. This is where the stoic feminine emerges, the woman who embodies the teachings of Seneca without ever reading a word. She honors her emotions, but she does not become enslaved by them. She feels deeply, but she acts wisely. She observes without reacting. She steps back not to punish, but to preserve. And that is the most threatening form of detachment. It is not cruelty, it is self-protection. It is not withdrawal, it is alignment. It is not distance, it is sovereignty. In this sovereignty, a woman becomes untouchable in the most visceral, magnetic way. She is no longer operating from wounded feminine archetypes, no more over-explaining, no more fixing, no more begging for clarity from someone who communicates in confusion. She has transcended the patterns that kept her small. And in this transcendence, she becomes the woman a man realizes he might never experience again. This is the forbidden psychology. The more spiritually aligned a woman becomes, the more the masculine is drawn to her, not because she tries, but because she no longer does. And as this detachment deepens, something even more powerful begins to unfold inside her. As her detachment settles into something deeper than emotional restraint, she begins to witness the transformation happening within herself, a transformation so profound that it shifts not only how she relates to men, but how she relates to life itself. This is the phase Jung described as individuation, the moment a woman steps out of the roles she was trained to perform and becomes the architect of her own inner world. It is here that her detachment evolves from a reaction into a rebirth. She now understands that attachment rooted in fear is merely a shadow version of love, that clinging to a man emotionally is often a way of clinging to a story she was told about her worth. And when she finally stops trying to rescue or convince or prove her value, she steps into a new realm of feminine power, one that no longer operates through desperation, but through discernment. A man senses this shift not through your behavior, but through your energy. The energy that once reached outward now flows inward. The emotional gravity that once pulled toward him now orbits your own center. And this internal realignment alters everything. The woman who once anxiously checked messages now checks in with herself. The woman who once asked for clarity now provides her own. The woman who once waited becomes the woman who chooses. This evolution disrupts the masculine psyche at its core. Because when a woman no longer bases her identity on being chosen, the man who once assumed her presence feels the loss not as an inconvenience, but as a spiritual disturbance. Your detachment becomes a reminder that he is not the sun in your universe. He is merely one star among many. And the brightness of your self-awareness makes him recognize the dimness in his own efforts. This is where the regret begins to blossom inside him. Not the superficial regret born of ego, but the deep regret that comes when a man realizes he mishandled a woman who was aligned with her heart. He remembers the softness he overlooked, the devotion he dismissed, the emotional intelligence he took for granted. He realizes that your absence is not a silence, but a consequence. Yet your rebirth is no longer about him. It is not a strategy. It is not a performance meant to provoke longing. It is the natural result of emotional sobriety. When you detach, you stop believing in potential and begin listening to patterns. You stop romanticizing inconsistency and begin honoring your values. You stop chasing connection and begin nurturing self-respect. This is sacred feminine detachment, not the cold withdrawal of a wounded woman, but the calm elevation of one who has healed. She has descended into her shadows, faced the fears that once tied her to the wrong men, and emerged with a clarity that cannot be shaken. Her peace becomes her boundary, her intuition becomes her compass, her standards become her shield. And when she stands in this space, she becomes undeniably magnetic, not because she is trying to attract, but because she is aligned. Men feel this alignment long before they understand it. They sense the difference between a woman who needs and a woman who chooses. The first is replaceable. The second is unforgettable. This is the forbidden truth. Detachment doesn't push men away, attachment does. Detachment allows love to flow freely without suffocation. It allows attraction to breathe. It allows the masculine to rise or fall on its own merit without being held up by the feminine. A detached woman gives a man the space to reveal his true nature, whether it leads him back to her or away from her. And in that revelation, she finds peace. She no longer fears losing anyone because she has reclaimed the one person she was truly meant to keep, herself. She no longer seeks closure from others because she carries it within her. She no longer battles for connection because her worth is no longer tied to being chosen. She chooses herself, and in that choice, she becomes the embodiment of Jung's most foundational truth, that wholeness is not found in another person, but in the integration of one's own soul. And so her journey ends not in longing, but in liberation, not in sorrow, but in sovereignty. The woman who once fragmented herself for love becomes the woman who loves herself whole. And as she walks forward with calm detachment, the world, and the men within it, feel the shift.